Has that worked? Yeah, happy days. We got all our tech issues out the way. Great, right, I will jump straight in, but I'll say, just to speak to what Helen said at the start, that I'm conscious that although we're kind of in the academic arm of the centre at the moment, that hopefully some of what I say is kind of geared towards thinking about how we can put this into non-academic use as well. So, some women were watching: traumatic victimisation and female witness to the crucifixion. Across the canonical Gospels, women are consistently identified as witnesses to Jesus' passion. This paper will utilise trauma theory as a heuristic lens to explore the potential impact of their exposure to this violence, considering how their traumatic victimisation under patriarchy intersects with the experience. It will offer a reading of female witness to the crucifixion in light of our developing theologies of trauma, which can illuminate the text and provide a model for conscious consideration of gendered trauma in lived communities. So, introducing the lens of trauma. Simply understood, trauma is a state of psychological distress, influencing emotions and behaviours, usually in response to an external stimulus. It is etymologically rooted in the concept of wounding, and as Shelley Rambo notes, trauma frequently persists in symptoms that live on in the body. Judith Herman's 1991 work, Trauma and Recovery, marked the primary shift of the study of trauma from medicine and psychology into the wider domain, including in turn an increasing engagement between trauma studies and theology. Trauma-sensitive readings have proven a fruitful means of engaging biblical texts too, evident in different ways in the work of Shelley Rambo, Kirsty Cobb, and Adele Reinhardt, among others. Kathy Carruth's work in literary trauma theory has been broadly influential. Her account of trauma as something which cannot be directly represented has been criticised for its consideration of power dynamics by Victoria Burrows and an over-reliance on a specific causal framework by Greg Forter. Nonetheless, it remains formative in modelling nuance in trauma-informed reading of texts such as the Gospels. Carruth has highlighted trauma's insistent appearance outside the boundaries of any single place or time. This multiplicity serves as a reminder to attend to the subtleties and margins of the biblical text when reading through the lens of trauma, and to resist linear expectations of how and when trauma may be encoded in the narrative. Reading against the grain of the gospel text, i.e. not focusing on the Christological androcentric account that reads most easily, allows for new insights, informed by contemporary ideas which illuminate the text in a new way. One of the earliest exponents of applying trauma insights to biblical text, Daniel Smith Christopher, has rightly cautioned that care must be taken when acquainting ancient and modern societies, and warned against making definitive or global assertions based upon specific psychological studies. With this in mind, presenting this trauma-informed reading of the women at the Passion is not to make anachronistic claims, to diagnose, or to assert historical reality. Rather, it aims to use the insights of trauma studies to consider the text anew, as we interpret it today. The study of trauma may be relatively new, but the phenomenon is not. Indeed, there's a cruel irony to the correlation between dismissals of women's witness to the resurrection and the origins of trauma theorizing in studies of women in the 19th century by psychoanalysts such as Freud, all of whom have shared the appellation hysterical women. Patriarchy, power, and violence. Auerbach has described biblical texts as fraught with background, and any examination of women's experiences in the gospel must be considered against the backdrop of patriarchy. Patriarchy is a mix of privileges and oppressions that has formative impact on our lived experiences and the intellectual domain of knowledge formation that shapes those experiences. Though often addressed abstractly, its power constructions are concrete and at work in the way we think, act, and experience our embodied existence. However, as intersectionality as a critical framework illustrates, gender is only one of several ways in which individuals are included and excluded. In the context of the women in the Gospels, the intersection of patriarchy with imperialism is key. So an obvious but often overlooked factor that underpins our study of the women of the New Testament is the fact that we're reliant on the perspectives of men who are detached from the specific social location that the women occupy. It's important to note that this is a reading which reflects the reality of patriarchy rather than an indictment of Judaism in particular, a perspective which slides all too easily into supersessionism and anti-Semitic tropes. So when Talleyrand notes that patriarchy is the single most influential factor in determining Jewish women's position in the world of the New Testament, we must not overread the function of the adjective. The women's story is told through a patriarchal lens in narrative and narration, and so readings which seek to explore their story must be sensitive to this. Trauma-informed and feminist readings are united in their resistance to hegemonic powers that engage in harm. Patriarchy also contextualizes the violence in the gospel stories. As David Kleins has noted in various publications, the name for strength in action in traditional male terms is violence. Male violence remains at the forefront of contemporary discourse around patriarchy, both for those who highlight it as a specific societal problem and those who want to reiterate that not all men are perpetrators. The cornerstone of the latter position is to point out that men are frequently subjected to violence too, a point relevant to our purposes today as we see it in the Crucifixion. But I think this position fails to fully consider two key aspects of patriarchal violence that are important. Firstly, that regardless of the gender of the person subjected to violence, the gender of the perpetrator is overwhelmingly likely to be male. And secondly, that the hierarchical nature of a paradigm which centres particular male lives and experiences normative and superior depends on violence to maintain its structure and express the power claimed thereby. This necessarily others women, but also trans persons and those whose gender identity is fluid or sited outside the male-female binary. For anyone who's not centred and elevated under patriarchy, it is then a normatively traumatogenic institution. In Traumata, Mira Atkinson coins the neologism traumarchy to describe this way in which patriarchy perpetuates traumas, which she sees as manifest in racism, sexism, and violence. In so doing, she offers us a model which recognises the complex interaction between specific instances of violence, such as events like the Crucifixion, the power structures which enable them, and the trauma that ensues as a consequence, which can be personal, cultural, and transgenerational. For women and others who do not form to the hegemonic model of masculinity, patriarchy is a source of traumatic victimisation. Crucifixion, then, can be understood as an expression of toxic patriarchal power and an outpouring of masculinity, especially when understood in the context of Roman imperial violence. The repeated cycles of revolt and reconquest that characterise the Roman occupation of Palestine mean that, in Horsley's terms, Jesus pursued his mission in a historical period framed by imperial violence against the Judean and Galilean people and their repeated struggle for independence. As well as the gender distinction, Herodias is the outlier as a lone female perpetrator, the gospel narratives overwhelmingly present violence as being enacted by those in power. In Matthew, for example, Carter's demonstrated that violence by ruling elites predominates. So the women who witness the crucifixion, therefore, are familiar with an imperial hierarchy sustained by violence. As well as the literal brutality of crucifixion, the idealized imperial masculinity of Rome is elevated by the emasculation of its enemies. As pointed out by Asakine and Wilson and plenty of others, Jesus' torture and death are constructed to compromise his masculinity by hegemonic standards. Glancy has argued that the ritualized stripping of masculinity in crucifixion would be clear to an ancient audience, regardless of the lack of graphic details in gospel accounts. This line of argument draws upon Walters, who reasons that public vulnerability and being unable to protect the body from violation runs contrary to Roman models of masculinity. And the very notion that being made less like a man, and thus more like a woman, as the ultimate debasement, not only makes the women's wider marginalisation clear, it also brings the association between masculinity and violence into sharper focus, as expressions and tools of patriarchal models of imperial power. The ideology of empire and the masculine ideal necessitates a feminized other. Women are explicitly others at the intersection of patriarchy and Roman imperialism, and violence is the means of their exclusion. Thus, in the moment of the crucifixion, the women are bearing witness not only to a violent reality in the present and all of the trauma that may entail, but also the fullest expression of a cultural ideology that is reliant upon their victimization. A trauma-informed reading of the Passion narratives therefore demands that we consider what the women's witness of Jesus' death means in an environment where they are the contingent objects of patriarchal violence. Trauma theory after Freud has typically conceptualized psychologically traumatizing events as punctual, i.e., like physical trauma, that is a specific moment or series of moments that cause it. This is seen in Judith Herman's focus on atrocities, an umbrella term which incorporates a range of common traumatic events such as assault, and Kathy Carroll's exploration of overwhelming violent events. In the passion narratives, as we'll see shortly, we're able to recognise a series of such punctual moments that might induce trauma for the women witnesses. Any one of these events, let alone their prompt succession, would constitute a traumatising event. However, Forster rightly recognises that trauma is not always induced by major extraordinary moments, but also by what he describes as the mundanely catastrophic. He notes traumas are also so chronic and cumulative, so woven into the fabric of our societies, that they cannot count as shocks. Following this description, it's clear that the habituation of women as the objects of violence under patriarchy is an example of naturalised trauma. This type of gendered cultural victimisation does not rely on a punctual event, either to induce trauma or raise consciousness of it, but rather is an ongoing trauma as a result of their social exclusion. Though there is not a cataclysmic moment, as we recognise in their witness to the crucifixion, it's important to acknowledge the impact of this trauma too. To overlook that prolonged subjugation also invokes trauma responses is to naturalise the power systems that sustain it. More, whatever normalised violence these women are exposed to, as both colonised people and women under patriarchy, does not limit the trauma of their witness to the crucifixion. Instead, it compounds it. So, let's turn to reading this through the lens of trauma. Eiermann's description of trauma as a consequence of shocking occurrences which profoundly affect an individual's life might well have been written about what those present at Jesus' crucifixion witnessed. Yet, though crucifixion is fundamentally an expression of violence, as observed by Fleming Rutledge, this is not the aspect of Christ's death that takes up the most scriptural attention. When the violence is directly described, it is neither graphic nor emotive, and physical details are often passed over in favour of narrative, literary, and theological constructions. The sacrifice that the women witness is introduced largely in symbolic terms in the synoptic accounts of the Last Supper, when Jesus identifies that his body will be broken and blood will be spilled. The eschatological focus of interpreting these passages in the light of the resurrection can supersede the extremity of the physical sacrifice that is made. Yet the grueling details are still apparent as Jesus is beaten and spat at, forced to carry the implement of his execution, crucified, derided at his most vulnerable, and subject to a painful and public death. Aspects of trauma are also coded in plain sight in the narrative. The rending of the veil of the temple is an embodiment of the rupture of the symbolic order, which Hartman recognises as central to traumatic experiences. So across these passion accounts, there is an emphasis on female witness. John identifies 3 Marys at the foot of the cross by name, and Luke flags the presence of the women amongst the onlooking acquaintances. Matthew and Mark identify women witnesses as a distinct group. Greater focus on the trauma of the women calls attention to the reality of the violence that is being witnessed. The violence functions almost implicitly in the narrative because it is so familiar to us as readers. But the women witnesses are watching this being exhibited towards someone who they have followed, served, and developed a profound relationship with. Thinking with their wider traumatic victimisation, it's clear that the almost throwaway line "some women were watching" overlooks the visceral experience of their witness. Nevertheless, this also aptly reflects the latency that often characterises the psychological aspects of trauma. It's not always apparent in the moment of exposure, but frequently manifests later. Just as we might overlook the women's trauma in this moment by the incidental reference, so the full ramifications might not be recognised by survivors until later. As such, reading through the lens of trauma shows that while the little narrative space given to recognising the witness of the women can underplay their significance, it does also reflect the way in which harm is not necessarily focused in that moment. Importantly, the act of witness alone can cause these women harm too. Dori Laub, a psychiatrist and trauma survivor, has observed that bearing witness even to the testimony of another's trauma has a material impact, where the witness comes to feel the bewilderment, injury, confusion, dread, and conflicts that the trauma victim feels. This comes in addition, therefore, to the personal trauma that the women are experiencing individually. Already, the complex repercussions of both direct and indirect exposure to violence are apparent. The women's trauma is uniquely compounded by their social location as women under patriarchy and colonised peoples, where, as noted previously, they're habituated to being the object in a culture of violence. As such, there's an additional traumatic burden of empathy. They are, in a very real sense, suffering alongside Jesus. Thus, the lens of trauma reminds us that the comment in Matthew and Mark that the women were looking on at a distance need not be a condemnation of their relationship with Jesus. It's possible for Jesus to be isolated and for the women to still feel close to him in their shared trauma. This is corroborated further by the fact that Mary Magdalene and at least one other woman are also witness to the burial. Just as John 13:1 notes that having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end, so the women remain faithful witnesses to the end, despite their own suffering. An important model for engaging with trauma survivors more broadly also comes in the gospel accounts of the women's witness to the resurrection. The evangelists are ambiguous in their various descriptions of the women's alarm and upset. We tend to read this comfortably as an expression of their shock at the body's absence or Jesus' presence. But a trauma-sensitive reading confers recognition that these responses may also be a physical manifestation of their trauma. Trauma is materially compounded in the body, and the physical effects behave as if the trauma is current. Trauma triggers need not be in themselves upsetting, they only need to stimulate recall of a traumatic experience. So even returning to the tomb will necessarily recall their previous visit witnessing his burial, and according to John 20:27, Jesus' body still bore the marks of his violent death. So a trauma response is not surprising. An effective case study in this regard comes through Shelley Rambo's exploration of trauma responses in John's account of Mary Magdalene's witness to the resurrection. Rambo argues that the Magdalene's weeping, being noted twice in John 20:13 and 15, is not a condemnation of her hysteria, but rather a recognition that her witness is forged through her tears. Thus, where early critics such as Celsus regard the Magdalene dismissively as a half-frantic woman, Rambo instead recognises this as the impact of trauma. This trauma shapes her witness, but as affirmed later in the passage in verse 16, does not preclude its significance or validity. The same Magdalene who experienced the compounded trauma at the foot of the cross is the first witness to the resurrection for John, and thereby the first bearer of the core message of Christianity. This status of the Magdalene or the women as crucial first witnesses serves to illustrate that traumatic experiences of violence, which have enduring physical and psychological effects, do not invalidate those who survive them. Through the lens of trauma, the heroes of this story are left with a choice. Do we act akin to those who ensure women are disbelieved, disregarded, and displaced because of their trauma? Or are we willing to accept them in their full and complex humanity and hear what they have to say? It's also really important to note that the women's trauma is not fixed in some sense by the resurrection. In both Broken Bodies and Ruptured Voices, Karen O'Donnell discusses the personal individual nature of processing trauma in its aftermath. The joy of the resurrection does not immediately negate the trauma of the crucifixion. It is an external, additional, and separate experience. Thus, when the joy of the resurrection is a source of liturgy, preaching, and catechesis, it must not be a source of denial of the experience of trauma survivors either. So just to offer some quick conclusions. A trauma-informed reading of the canonical Passion accounts foregrounds the ways in which these women witnesses are the embodiment of discipleship. Even in their act of witness, these are women who are picking up the cross. Such a reading is not to glorify their trauma or to compete it somehow with Jesus' suffering. Rather, it recognises adjacently the immense personal cost of this discipleship. With this in mind, the conclusion of their narrative arc with criticism and disbelief seems all the more damning. It also makes a mockery of the excuse for the male disciples' desertion that there was no risk for the women by their presence. Overall, a trauma-informed reading of these texts has clear benefits for their interpretation and application. From a feminist point of view, it allows us to recognise the significance of the women in a narrative where they are never the focus, and explore details of the text without resorting to patriarchal tropes of hysteria. Cheryl Exham's analogy of women being raped by the pen is opposite here. This type of resistant reading pushes back at the subjugation of women and their experiences inherent in the mode and substance of their description. More, it forces us to think critically about how we engage with violence and the wider impact on those who are exposed to it. In a specific way, it demands reconsideration of how we engage with those who have suffered violence and trauma, especially in relation to how we handle gospel accounts of Jesus' suffering. Some women were watching, and some are watching still.
We already have a question from Kiersey, and I'm pretty sure I mispronounced your name, Kiersey. I'm very sorry. But she says, thank you for this brilliant paper. Very enlightening. Could you please expand on the point that the women standing at a distance is not necessarily an indictment on them? You mentioned something about the women and Jesus being together in their shared trauma, which was I had the same question. So
yeah, so I think what I mean by that is that there's sometimes a sense that the inclusion of that detail, that they're at a distance, can feel almost like a little bit of a dig, like they're there, but they're not really there. So it's also fine that no one else is there either. But actually, I think if you look at it through this way and think about what's going on for them, they are very there. It doesn't matter whether they're stood right at the foot of the cross like you have in John, or whether they're stood wherever Mark and Matthew want to put them, but they are having a physical experience just in a comparable or at least adjacent way, I think.
So reading that sentence through trauma theory really brings bridges the distance that is in the text then. Yeah,
exactly. I think because we're often kind of picking through the bones of the text to find stories of women, when we've got something that allows us to kind of expand on it without sort of requiring us to do too many sort of mental gymnastics, then I think it's a really useful way of sort of expanding what is present in the text.
Thank you. We have another question from Helen. She says, thank you so much, Siobhán. That was very thought-provoking. Could you comment on the idea, I think I read somewhere, that the early church is characterized and shaped by its shared trauma? Does this extend beyond the first generation?
Yeah, so this is a kind of, it's picked up in a few different ways, and probably the example that kind of leaps to mind for me is Adele Reinhardt, who takes a reading of Imagining the Johannine Community in this way. I think even if you take the line that these texts are this narrative expression of trauma and working through it, I'm cautious about the idea of it extending beyond the first generation, because I worry that kind of experience, I think it is distinct in some way. And I don't necessarily feel comfortable with the idea of suggesting that there's some sort of traumatic inheritance in Christianity that is in any way materially comparable to the type of traumatic experiences that people have in a very immediate and personal sense. And I do think it's different to other transgeneration and cultural traumas, because regardless of little pockets of it, for the most part, Christians don't share that experience of trauma, danger, and persecution. And so I think I'm kind of a little bit resistant to looking at beyond that, just because I feel like that does a bit of a disservice to some other experiences.
Okay, we have a final question for now, at least from John. Very helpful approach. A question about gender dynamics. I was fascinated by the idea that Jesus suffering could be read as a demasculinization or feminization. Thought comes to mind that in early Christian tradition, the stories of female martyrs are elevated in heroic ways. Acts of Paul and Thecla, for example. I wonder what gender dynamics are at play when these female martyrs are venerated early in the tradition. An open question, perhaps you have thoughts and comments, which I'm sure you do.
I do. You've opened a can of worms there, John. I'm going to be emailing you all kinds now, spamming you. Yeah, so this idea is picked up in lots of different things, both in a historical context and more in a sort of biblical studies context. And probably the place that I'd send you to for that is Brittany Wilson, as something that's kind of really readable and engaging. But it crops up in loads of different ways, and I think David Toombs is here, so he's kind of explored that further in relation to sexual violence, and so there's lots of mileage in that. I think what's interesting when you look at those early female martyrs is that their heroism, I think, is masculized, and even if we just think about like cutting off of hair and things like that, and the kind of symbols that are encoded there. So I do think those gender dynamics are still sustained, But I think one of the reasons that those female martyrs are so interesting is because just by their existence, they're kind of pushing back at it, even if the narratives themselves are shaped to masculinize them in their valor.
Thank you, Siobhán. All right, moving right along.